Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how I made a cover for my interlocker, otherwise known as a serger. This tutorial could be used to make a cover for anything vaguely box-shaped. It doesn't have to be a sewing machine. The cover that I was previously using for my interlocker was literally a bit of foam packaging stapled together, so I thought it deserved something better. I've had a 90s McDonald's pillowcase lying around for quite a while now and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it, but I thought this would be the perfect project. So I thought I would repurpose it as the front and back panels of the cover, and I'm also going to use some leftover fabric from another project, as well as an old duvet cover. Okay, so what are you going to need for this project? Well, mainly you're going to need some fabric. As discussed before, I'm going to be using some woven cotton material from a pillowcase and a duvet cover, as well as some blue flannelette. I would definitely recommend using woven fabrics, not stretchy fabrics. You'll also need some scissors, a disappearing or magic fabric pen or pencil, an iron and ironing board, a metal ruler, a tape measure, a sewing machine and some thread to match the fabrics, and some sewing pins. I would also recommend a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, although you could just use scissors instead, and also a hand sewing needle and thread. And one more thing is iron-on interfacing. I'm going to be using heavyweight iron-on interfacing because the pillowcase I'm using is very light and floppy, but I want the finished cover to have some structure and basically be able to stand up on its own. If you don't want as much structure or you're using stiffer fabrics anyway, calico for instance, then you may want a lighter weight interfacing or none at all. Right, so the first thing is to work out all of the measurements for all the different parts. The cover will go together in 5 parts, not including the lining. These are the top, the 2 sides, the front and the back panels. To work out how big these panels will need to be, you first need to measure your sewing machine or whatever else you want to cover. You'll need to imagine your sewing machine as a box shape and measure the machine at the widest, the longest and the highest points. To calculate how big each panel will need to be, you then need to add the following amount to each measurement. 2 times the seam allowance you're going to use, plus a tiny bit extra for give, as you don't want the cover to be super tight. Personally, I'll be using a seam allowance of 1 centimetre or so, and I added 3 centimetres to each of the sewing machine measurements. So for example, my machine is 30 centimetres high and 35 centimetres wide. So my front and back panels will measure 30 plus 3 equals 33 centimetres high, and 35 plus 3 is 38 centimetres wide. Obviously, the 2 side panels will be the same size, and the front and the back panels will also be the same size. Once you've worked out how big all your panels need to be, you can move on to the next step, which is where we're going to cut out all of the fabric pieces. To do this, I used my disappearing fabric pen, a ruler, a cutting mat, and a rotary cutter. I first used my ruler and my fabric pen to draw out the size of the front and the back panels onto my pillowcase. So once I'd drawn the outline, 33 by 38 centimetres in my case, I used my ruler and rotary cutter on top of a cutting mat to cut out the 2 pieces. Note that I kept the pillowcase intact, so when I cut along these lines, I cut out the front and the back panels in one go. I then drew around these pieces onto my duvet cover, which is what I'm going to be using for the lining. For every fabric panel that you're going to cut out, in my case 5 panels, you're going to need a piece of fabric in a matching size for the lining. So obviously here I'm just cutting out the 2 pieces of lining fabric that will match the front and the back panels. As before, I'm cutting through a folded duvet cover, so I'm cutting through 2 layers at once. After that step, you'll have the front and the back panels, and also 2 identically sized pieces of the lining fabric. You then need to do exactly the same for the sides and the top, to give you 2 side panels and a top panel, all with matching pieces of lining fabric. So in my case, that's 10 pieces of fabric overall. If you're making a cover for a sewing machine rather than an interlocker, the only possible difference would be you might need to incorporate a hole in the top of the cover for the handle of the machine. Once we've finished cutting everything out, we then need to attach some interfacing to all of the outer panels. So that's the 5 outer panels and not the pieces of lining. These pieces of interfacing need to be smaller than the fabric pieces by at least the seam allowance amount all the way around. In my case, I made the interfacing pieces smaller by just over 1 centimetre all around the edges. The easiest way to do this is to draw around each fabric panel onto the interfacing, and then cut along this line. You then just need to cut off the seam allowance amount, or a tiny bit more, from each of the 4 edges. Next, place the interfacing onto the centre of the back of the fabric panel and iron it all over to attach it. Make sure that the interfacing is glue side down, the glue side being the shiny or the rough side. The iron needs to be pressed down onto the interfacing for several seconds for the glue to melt and attach it to the fabric. Do the same for all of the outer fabric panels, which is 5 pieces in total. Right, so now we get to sew the panels together. So place your top panel on your work surface right side up, so the interfacing will be underneath. Then place one of the side panels right side down on top, and line up a side edge with a side edge of the top panel. These 2 edges should be the same length. Pin and then sew along this edge, using the seam allowance you've previously chosen. The stitches should lie next to the interfacing rather than go through it. I just used the default straight stitch on my sewing machine, and I made sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Please also note that you should start and end your line of sewing stitches a short distance away from the edge of the fabric piece. This short distance should be the same as the seam allowance. So in my case, I start stitching 1 centimetre from the edge and finish stitching 1 centimetre from the edge. This is simply to make it easier for you in the next step. Next, you attach the other side panel in exactly the same way, by placing it right side down on top and then lining up a side edge with the remaining shorter edge of the top panel underneath. Then pin and sew these 2 edges together as you did before. You should now have a side panel attached to each short edge of the top panel. We now need to attach the front and back panels to the top panel in exactly the same way. Place the front panel face down on top of the top panel. Line up the top edge of the front panel with a long edge on the top panel. Both edges should be the same length. Pin and sew these edges together, again starting and ending a seam allowance distance away from the fabric edge. Just make sure to double check that if these panels have an image on them, that they're attached in the correct orientation. And then do exactly the same with the back panel to attach it to the remaining long edge of the top piece. You should now have all 5 fabric pieces sewn together in a cross shape. In order to complete the box shape, you will now need to sew the sides of the fabric panels together. So line up 2 adjacent side edges and pin them together. Then sew along these edges, but stop a seam allowance distance from the bottom edge. Do the same 3 more times to form the 4 corners of the box. You will then need to repeat these sewing steps with the lining fabric. So you would join the side panels to the top panel, then the front and back panels to the top panel, and then lastly sew up the side edges. And this will give you a box made of lining fabric, exactly the same size as the outer shell. The only difference is it doesn't have interfacing attached. Take the box you made previously from the outer fabrics and turn it right side out. Then insert it into the box made of lining fabric. So in other words, you put the outer cover into the inner cover, right sides together. Make sure that the lining is pulled up as far as it will go, and the corners all line up. Then pin the 2 layers together all around that top edge. Then sew all around this edge and through all 4 corners, but leave one of the short edges unsewn. This will need to be left open. The reason for leaving that short edge unsewn is that now you're going to turn everything right side out by pulling the fabric through that gap. Then push the lining back into the outer cover. Along the short edge where the opening is, fold the edges inwards and then pin them together. Also insert a few pins around the rest of the edge to hold the 2 layers in place. Then top stitch all around this edge. I did this around 5mm from the edge, so half of what I was using for the seam allowance. This will close up the opening in the fabric as well as finish off the cover. Once you've done that, you should press it with an iron to make it look extra neat. As a last step, if you want to, you can also use a hand sewing needle and matching thread to do a few small stitches in each corner, just to join the lining to the outer shell. And that's it, you've now made a lined sewing machine cover. I really hope you've enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.